Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of Dr. Marie Speaks. My name is Toroshinia Kennedy, and I am the producer of this new podcast and talk series, during which my good friend and author, Dr. Marie Brown Mercadel, and I take a deep dive into her new book. It's titled Getting to My Enough, a story of faith, resilience, and survival. In her memoir, Dr. Marie describes her remarkable journey of persevering through unspeakable childhood sexual trauma, the loss of a baby as a teenager, and her tenacious resolve to get to her enough. Her frank and detailed descriptions of her life experiences are riveting, and they provide proof that it is possible to achieve personal triumph despite the odds. In Getting to My Enough, Dr. Marie Brown Mercadel writes about the deep-seated emotions that caused her to be overwhelmed with self-doubt, fear, and shame for much of her adult life. Her acts of forgiveness and the adoption of self-love represent an important source of her healing. So this Dr. Marie Speaks series and podcast was developed for the purpose of giving a space to women to listen, learn, contribute, and advance conversations related to overcoming trauma, Black mental health, the myth of the angry Black woman, and the imposter syndrome, healing, forgiveness, and a variety of other topics. So I want you to know clearly, first thing, that as we go through this discussion series, we may speak graphically about a few topics. If you find that you are experiencing any type of secondary trauma, please feel free to pause the show and resume listening at a later date or not listening at all. So, Dr. Marie, let's get into this. Tell me and tell our audience a little bit about your background and your why for doing this discussion series.
Tori, thank you so much for this partnership and for working with me on delivering this podcast. So to tell you a little bit about my background, I'm a recovering county employee. I spent about 25 years working in city and county government, a total of 38 years working in human services because it was always my passion, giving back and working with the community. And my husband was in the military for 30 years. He retired. We were together for 20 of those 30 years. And I had the great opportunity to move around the country with him and work in different organizations in Texas and Louisiana and California and in North Carolina, where I was when I met him. And so I've had a very good career in human services and then have several executive level positions, and I got my doctorate in 2016 and was really, doing well in terms of my work life. But I was still missing something. When I got my doctorate, I thought that was going to be it. I'm going to get my doctorate and I'm going to start feeling great and like I'm really accomplished this thing. And then I got a promotion and started making a lot more money. And I was like, no, that's going to be it. That's going to be the thing. That's going to make me feel better. Got the car, got the promotion, got the hood. And I was still feeling like, no, you're not done. There is something more out there. You have to tell your story. So about 2 years ago, I started this journey of writing my memoir. At the time, I was serving as the Chief Operating Officer for the Urban Core of San Diego County, and I had recently retired from county government after 38 years of serving the community. So I was at a place in my life where I was working because I felt like I still had a lot more to give back to the community, but I was feeling just very restless. And in a way, I was feeling very unfulfilled. People always talk about, oh, you're doing such a great job and you've accomplished all these things and achieved all these things, but it wasn't enough for me. I was still seeking to do something that I thought would be larger and could have even a higher level of impact on people. I have been mentoring women and coaching women for the past 15 years and helping them get to their enough. How do they understand, who they are, their own strengths and talents, so that they can either, promote within a job or understand if this is the job or career for them, or dealing with own relationship issues or self-esteem issues. And every woman that I coached had some type of emotional barrier that was holding them back. Not because they didn't have the education or the experience, but it was an emotional barrier. And so I knew that I had to tell I knew that I had to tell my story about surviving childhood trauma, about surviving going through an abortion as a teenager, as a 14-year-old, about dealing with low self-esteem, even though it all looked good on the outside. On the inside, I was really floundering. And so I wanted people to know that, though, there's a process that you can go through to heal, that you don't have to live in it. And so that was my why for spending 2 years writing this book. Some days I wrote, 4 or 5 pages a day, and other times I stepped away from the book for a month or 2 or 3 because I was reliving every single thing that happened to me. I was reliving it, and I underestimated what that secondary trauma would feel like. Is going back again and reading what happened to me. It was like sometimes I was, looking down on this happening, to someone else. But as difficult as it was, I knew that I could have a breakthrough with others if I just continued on the path to let them know that you can do this and you can heal. And so, kind of what I'd like to hear about now is, your main reason for producing this show.
Well, Marie, thank you for asking that question. And for people who are new to Marie and I, they don't know that we are friends. I've known Marie for about 10 years when she worked in local government and county government. I had the honor of meeting with her and interacting with her on occasion due to my role in a previous job. But I was drawn to her. I've been drawn to you, Marie, because I think you're just such an amazing woman and a really supportive mentor. But also, when we recently started working on our budding podcast called Hugh Matters, I was impressed every time you talked about writing your memoir. And particularly because we know writing a memoir is no easy feat, but also because having known a little bit about your background, I knew that writing, delving into this part of your history meant that you would have to revisit some very painful parts of your past. And that sparked my compassion for you. And then after learning that the book was finally finished and that it was published, I knew I wanted to do something to help support you and to also help support your effort with helping guide and support other women in their similar journeys to getting to their enough. So here I am.
I'm very appreciative of the partnership and the support that you have given me over the years. Sometimes you meet people and you just know, right? You have that connection. I think we've gone months without talking sometime, because we're busy. But then we get together and then we still connect as if we just talked yesterday. And that's what the bond and the sisterhood is about. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely. So now that we've introduced ourselves and talked about why we are doing this Dr. Marie Speaks discussion series and podcast, let's jump into today's discussion. Today we're going to talk about the first section of your book, which is called The Beginning, and it covers chapters 1 through 4. I got to tell you, I got to be frank, reading those chapters, especially chapter 1, you really get into it. You start off by talking about directly discussing the source of your childhood trauma. And I have to tell you, it was really difficult for me to read, not having experienced that. And then it just made me think about, the people in the world, you and others who've experienced that directly. And it was very difficult to read. And with that, I have to say, I appreciated the fact that in your book, you had a foreword with a trigger warning, because, not only was your pain real and the experience that you talk about in your family home, in the bathroom that, started off your traumatic 3 or 4 years of trauma. I'm glad that you had that trigger warning, because otherwise I think, I, as well as other readers, would have been just floored, even more so than we already were. So let's talk about those chapters, starting with chapter 1 and that passage about, let's talk about what you were feeling when you wrote about that.
And so the passage that I start out with is, the very first chapter of the book is, and here is the book, by the way.
Yay!
is my most prominent memories involve the molestation that I suffered at the hands of my older brother. I talk about an instance that stands out in my mind. In January of 1971, when I was stretched out on the floor and he was straddling me, I remember the lingering smell of bleach from the bathtub and bathroom being freshly cleaned, and it invaded my nostrils when he pushed me alongside the floor. And so I know that this passage set the tone for the entire book. And when I started writing, I wanted the reader to be riveted about how I remember the early stages of my life. You know, some people remember the time they got cotton candy at the fair, or some people remember their first pony ride, or, you know, playing outside with their friends and riding bikes and all of these things. And I had some of those experiences, but it wasn't the one that I recall most vividly. So when I wrote that passage, I mean, I revised and reread that chapter. It had to be over 200 times. And each time I read it, I felt the same. I relived it. And when I closed my eyes, I was on the bathroom floor again. But the therapeutic aspect for me in writing it is that I could tell that I was getting into a place of healing by releasing the sense of shame that I held because of the molestation. Very few people knew about the depth or the duration of my experience. And so many of these thoughts that I had inside my head and my soul were there for, 50 years. So, obviously my husband knew about it. A couple of my close friends knew about it. I talked to them about it, but I wasn't descriptive about it. And so I think it's easy to say, oh, well, that happened to someone. But if you don't understand the descriptiveness of that or the actual things that happened, it's hard to conceptualize, especially if you don't have that experience. And I have to tell you that I don't wish this experience on anyone. But at the same time, that experience really shaped the path of the person that I am today.
So, chapter 1,
Mhm.
that first experience, and I mentioned earlier, this is, I thought it was around 3 years,
Mhm.
but please clarify. Was the time frame? How long did you have to experience this repeated trauma, and then also for others who've experienced it? I mean, for those of us who haven't experienced it, how common is this? How often does it occur?
Unfortunately, it's a common occurrence. Right now, while we're doing this podcast, there is a child that's being sexually abused, and it's likely by a family member. So the abuse started when I was around 7, and it continued on for about 3 years. The troubling part, is that it's not atypical. I mean, sexual abuse of children has been veiled in the fabric of society for centuries, dating back to the Middle Ages. Later in the book, I talk about some research that was done by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and they reported that in 2008, more than 70,000 children were sexually abused. And that involves 1 in 5 girls and 1 in 20 boys. It's more commonly girls. And you know what? Most perpetrators of sexual abuse are family members. Family members. And the statistics suggest that the prevalence of sexual abuse in Black families is the same as it is in Caucasian families, yet Black families are less likely to involve the police in cases of sexual abuse due to the fear of embarrassment, the financial implications, the thought of breaking up the family structure. And so because of that, many victims deal with the impacts of sexual abuse in isolation. And sometimes parents know, children disclose to their family members, but for a variety of reasons, they choose not to involve, law enforcement. In the Black families, we really don't want the government involved anyway, right?
Right.
So in these instances, we're definitely less likely to have conversations. Interestingly enough, I spent 15 years of my career managing large child welfare programs. In my last county job, I was managing the 3rd largest child welfare entity in the state of California. And so I saw these cases come across my desk very, very frequently. And each and every time I saw those, it was a form of reliving them. And so it was, you talk about that trauma, that instant, those instances of it, they don't disappear.
Yeah, I could imagine. I mean, it just seems like, reliving it, the trauma over and over, how difficult that
Mhm,
is for you and anybody else who has to go
mhm,
through that
mhm,
first hand and then also the second hand trauma. But
mhm,
I want to go back to something you talked
mhm,
about,
mhm,
particularly in the Black community and communities of
mhm,
color, not wanting to involve law enforcement or any other
mhm,
sort of official government entity. Um, but within the family, when I'm reading these first four, when I read these first four chapters, you mentioned how you didn't tell anyone.
mhm,
So
mhm,
I understand the logic of not telling anyone outside the family, but why didn't you
mhm.
tell anyone in the family?
You know, as most little boys and girls, I mean, I was scared, and not only that, the perpetrator, told me that I better not tell anyone. And as a 7-year-old, if someone says, well, if you tell someone, you're going to get in trouble. I mean, I'm 7 and I'm listening to an almost adult, because he was 11 years older than me, tell me that I'm going to get in trouble. And I believe that. And also around the same time, there were a lot of things that were going on in my household. When the abuse first started, I lived with my mom and my dad and my 6 siblings. But around that same time, another equally traumatic experience for me was coming home from an outing with my godparents to discover that my parents were involved in an episode of domestic violence. And my mom sustained significant bruising on her face and upper extremities, and so that too was devastating. And shortly after that, she left our household, which we were living in North Carolina, and she moved to California. And so my dad raised myself and my siblings, which really was an anomaly back in the 1970s.
Mhm.
And so my entire world changed, because I suffered from the physical loss of my mom leaving the household. I tolerated the abuse because I didn't know any better. I mean, it really just became a part of my normal existence. And with all the things that were going on after my mom left, I just I was just trying to get to a sense of just having some kind of being normal or something maybe. But I
Right.
was 7, so it's like, you know, that's one of the things that you have. You typically you have the abuser that threatens, if you tell, I'm going to do this. If you tell, that's going to happen. And when you're 7, you believe it because you don't know any differently, because this was an adult. And so that's really why I didn't say anything to anyone at that time.
Okay, I do want to touch on your mom leaving the household, but before that, I just have to ask another question related to
I see
um
your wheels are just spinning.
yeah, they are. I mean, there's just so much going on, and that's just through the first four chapters, and they're very short chapters. And to
Mhm,
have this many questions, I'm just intrigued about, what else you have to share, but then at the same time, partly apprehensive about what else there is to be shared in the book. So, but talking about the perpetrator being a family member and you not telling, it's very typical, for in Black families and in most families to respect their elders. You even mentioned that in your book. And
yes.
so I can understand how that might be a reason why you may not have told anyone, because this is a sibling and from a 7-year-old's perspective is an adult and you want to respect the wishes of an adult, but this person was harming you. And in some way, that person, the perpetrator, must have known too that they were doing something that they knew their elders also would not want them to do. I mean, do you think in any way that crossed his mind? And did that cross your mind at all in terms of like not telling, like knowing that he had violated in some way, not just your trust, but
Mhm.
the precepts in the community of, and then in the family of respecting your elders and their wishes?
But if you think about it, perpetrators are manipulative, right? And so again, I'm 7 years old and he's my elder too. And so I'm listening to what he's telling me.
Mhm.
And I'm really thinking that I'm going to get in trouble. And so, that's why I initially didn't tell anyone. Later in the book, I talk about disclosing, but, it was after a couple of years and I wasn't telling anyone. I just made a statement, and that's kind of how it came out. And so and this is not atypical. If you just kind of, you'll see now and today where people are disclosing 20 years later, 25
Mhm.
years later, because a lot of victims don't disclose until they feel safe,
Yeah.
until they get to a place where they feel like they're safe enough to have the conversation. And I didn't feel safe because I believed him.
Yeah.
I believed that I was going to get in trouble. And I didn't want to get in trouble because there were so many things that were already going on in my household, with my mom leaving and, my dad trying to, pick up those pieces. And, I didn't want to get in trouble, and I didn't want to cause any further disruption in the structure of my household.
Okay. Well, thank you for
Yeah.
talking about that. And
Yeah.
then, so going back to your mom leaving the household, I mean, yes, it's talk about trauma on top of trauma. I mean, a
Mhm.
7-year-old girl, or any old, any child
Yeah.
needs their mom and their dad, and
Mhm.
but especially when you think about a 7-year-old girl having their
Yeah.
mom leave the household. So we know you were 7,
Mhm.
and it impacted you
Mhm.
greatly. I'm sure it impacted your siblings greatly. How old were they? And in what ways do you think that impact showed itself?
Yeah. So I was 7. I have a younger brother who was 3. My next oldest sister is 6 years older than I am, so she would have been 13. And then I had a sister that was 15. I had a sister that was turning 17. So my mom had 7 children by the time she was 31 years old. With
Wow.
her first child, she had at 15, which was not unusual back in those times in the
Right.
60s. Um, so that was not atypical, but by the time she was 31 years old, she had 7 children. And so, I was a 7-year old, but my sisters were teenagers, and you know how tumultuous it can be a teenager. And so, 2 of my sisters have passed away, and one of my sisters, I'm married, is still alive. And one of the things I tried to do in this book is really not try to tell anybody else's story. Tell my own story. So someone will say, "Oh, well, you didn't talk much about this person, or you didn't talk much about that person," because I don't have permission to tell anybody else's story. And everybody else's story has to be from their perspective of how they felt, right? But I could really see a sadness. I think I could see a sadness in all of us, because, how we talk about little boys need their dads. Well, little girls need their moms. We're going through things as little girls that we can't really talk to our dads about, or our mom was talking to us about things that she knew, as a young girl. But in a lot of ways, my mom was growing up alongside her children. And so, my sister, Gwen, my oldest sister, she helped my mom pack and leave to go to California because she was worried about her safety. But at the same time, I could really see the sparkle leave my sister Gwen's eyes when my mom left, because her and my mom, were really close. I mean, we were all close, but had her being older and being the oldest, and you have I think more of a bond as you get older, and you need your mom and that kind of thing. And so it was hard because about 2 days after the altercation, my mom left the house. I didn't know she was leaving, and I didn't understand what was happening. I just remember coming home from school each day, every day for about 2 weeks, looking for her and waiting for her to come home, and praying that she would make it home in time to tuck me in, and asking where she was. And, the question just kind of being, overlooked and redirected. Because, she wasn't coming back by that time. My dad knew she wasn't coming back. My sisters obviously knew, that she wasn't coming back. So I don't know if that was the only instance of domestic violence. It's the only episode that I was aware of. I had never even heard my parents argue before, or raise their voices, or anything. So I was really just shocked in that instance, when that happened.
I'm glad you mentioned not telling anybody else's story. Yeah, you want to be respectful of that, because I got to tell you, that did come up in my head, like,
Mhm.
okay, because you're talking about, it's an 800 square foot home, you're sharing a room with your sisters, your brothers are sharing a room, and your
Mhm.
parents are sharing a room, but we 800 square feet, you can
Mhm.
imagine if there was
Mhm.
any ongoing domestic violence at some
Mhm.
point, you would have heard it. And then also, going back to your sister Gwen, I did think about that, because I forget if it was chapter 2 or chapter 3, when you talk about, your sister Gwen and her helping your mom prepare to leave. But then at the same time, after you had been assaulted by your older brother, having Gwen call you to her about something that was completely unrelated. And so as a reader, I keep on thinking, gee, this is a smaller home. I'm with, well, at least for a family of 7. And how is it that people weren't aware? So part of me just kind of just wonders if it's just because of the naivety that comes along with youth. Do you think that had to do with it, of
Well,
not
you know,
being
you're
aware?
Well, we were always in and out of the house, in
Mhm.
school or activities. We actually went to Catholic school, so there was I'm blanking on there's altar boy practice. There was
Oh
choir.
yeah.
People were just kind of in and out of the house, a lot. My mom worked part-time as a waitress, so sometimes she was gone in the evenings. She worked part-time as a bus driver, so sometimes she was gone in the mornings. And so we were all at different stages of being in and out of the house, and no one's really expecting that this is happening, right? So you're just going about your normal business. And then perpetrators can be strategic, because sometimes your big brother is babysitting.
That's true.
And so because that's what they did back then. And so it's very, very strategic. They might be out working in the yard or gardening, or and it could have been a 5 or 6 or 7 minute episode. And so these things were quick. And obviously, I don't know if he's looking out and saying, hey, well, I know mom's not going to be home to this time, or I know my sister's not going to be home until this time. But I think he was just being very, very strategic. I mean, there were people in the house at
Mhm.
times when it happened.
So the assault at the hands of your older brother was, of course, very traumatic, but it was one source of trauma in your life.
Yes.
The other
Yes.
big source was your mom leaving the house, and
Mhm.
then the unusual environment of being raised by a single father. I mean,
Mhm.
that was so rare. I mean, we're seeing more of it nowadays, but
Mhm.
how did that affect you in telling your story, looking back? How do you think that affected you? Did it make you even I don't know, did it make you even more of a courageous young woman, or did it make you feel like awkward and an outsider? How did that impact you, not having your mom around, but a very present father, but still not very
Mhm.
emotionally present?
So not my mom. Once my mom left, we settled into a routine. With my sister Gwen being 17, she served as the matriarch of the family. We were 10 years apart, and when I was growing up, I always viewed her more as a mother figure than a sister, because she was so much older than I was. And she played a really key role in my life. Um, Without my mom present in the house, I really just kind of felt lost in the shuffle with my siblings, and everyone's trying to figure out, what to do next. My parents were married for 17 years before they split up. And
Wow.
so, we're accustomed to, my parents, being together. And so my home environment was different than others. And so I really felt like an outsider. I felt I was different because I didn't have a mom and a dad. My dad raised me. Again, that was an anomaly back in the 70s. A single dad, one child maybe, but 7. So that was difficult. What was also unique about the situation is that over time the lines of communication opened between my mom and my dad. And she advised him that she wanted to end the marriage, but she still wanted to be involved, in our lives to the extent possible. Um, they reconciled their differences to the point that they could be amicable and co-parent long distance. They never got a divorce. They were separated by the time my dad passed away. They had been separated for 25 or so years or more, and they never got divorced. They're both of the names were on the deed of a house that my dad built later. They still maintain the life insurance policies and some joint credit cards and all of those things. So they didn't argue. I mean, at it even got to the point where he agreed to have her come and come back and visit and stay with us, every summer, or at different times during the year. Sometimes it was in the summer, and sometimes it was other times during the year whenever she could work things out with her employer. But she came back to the home for about a month at a time. And, we tried to act as though we were a normal family for about 30 days, out of the year. I talked to her by telephone a lot. I knew that I still had a mom, but I was lonely and I was sad because I really felt like she had deserted me. And
Mm.
so, I think all of my siblings and I dealt with our pain in our own way. But I could see the sadness in my sisters, especially Gwen, because not only is she 17, but now she has to assume the role of mom. And
Yeah.
then later, the year that my mom left, she had her own baby at 17. So she's trying to raise a baby, and then she's trying to be a mom to kids that are her siblings.
So, having your mom leave, that's you were abandoned.
Yes.
You and your siblings were abandoned by your mom.
Hmm.
You also discuss how your father was abandoned by his parents.
Hmm.
And so there's sort of this legacy of abandonment. And I think, as you mentioned somewhere in one of the, I think it was chapter 2, maybe chapter 3, how your dad probably didn't want to repeat the pattern. And
Right.
so he, that's why, even though it was unconventional to see a man raising his children
Right.
solo, why he stuck around. But on
Mhm.
the same end, obviously this had an impact on you and your siblings. But since we're talking about your story,
Mhm.
um, how did this notion of abandonment impact you when you became a mother?
Mhm.
Um, how did it play out? Can you cite any
Oh yeah,
examples?
absolutely.
Mhm.
So I talk later in the book about leaving my daughter Chantel. I had my daughter Chantel. I was married for a couple of years. My daughter Chantel was born. That the marriage ended in divorce. I moved from Texas, where I was living at the time, back to North Carolina because I needed to get in school and finish, my degree that I had started, years earlier. And I moved to back to North Carolina the same year that Chantel was born. So kind of went through a series of, dead end jobs. I actually got fired from 2 jobs in 1 year.
Oh, gee.
And I felt like God was telling me that I needed to leave that city and go to a city that had universities and schools in which I could get my degree. So I took that message. However, the city that I moved to, I didn't know anybody there. And so I had to leave Chantel with my mom and my sister, who had moved. My mom had moved back to North Carolina by that time after my dad passed away to live in the family home. So I had to leave Chantel there with my mom and my sister, and it was a 2-hour drive back and forth. It was very important for me for Chantel to know that I wasn't leaving her so that I could party and have a good time. I
Yeah.
was leaving her because I had to work full time and I had to go to school full time, and I also had a part time job. Yet every single weekend, I went to visit with Chantel. I would leave on Fridays and I would come back on Monday mornings. Sometimes I would even get up at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning to drive to Chantel's school to have breakfast with her because they were having an event at school. And then I would drive back so that I could get to work or school on time, whatever was happening. My sister and my mom were very supportive at this time. Sometimes they would meet me halfway, so I only have to drive an hour, to pick her up and take her back. But I tried to be there for every single thing that she was doing. So I had a new car, and I'm glad that I had a new car because I had so many miles on that car from driving back and forth. Those that 2.5, 3 hours sometimes drive depending on traffic, because I never wanted her to feel what I felt. So if it was Halloween, that was one of her favorite holidays. I'd get off work and I'd get down there. We'd pass candy or go get candy. For an hour and a half, 2 hours, I'd get back on the road. So sometimes I was getting home at midnight. Sometimes I was leaving my house at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning to get to, whatever event, whether it was a play, whether it was whatever it was. I needed her to know that I wasn't abandoning her. And as soon as I graduated, I brought her to live with me. So it was about a 2.5 year period in which she remained with my mom and my sisters.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, I mean, those are just the first 4 chapters. And as I mentioned earlier, they're short chapters. We're
Yeah.
going to have a lot to talk about
Yeah.
as we continue to progress through the remaining chapters of the book. And
Mhm.
so with that said, we want to keep the conversation going. We want people to reach out to us and give us their input about the Dr. Marie Speaks discussion series, and how the book has touched them. And we're going to be back. We're going to be talking a lot more.
Mhm.
And we hope that this helps other people get to their enough.
Mhm.
Um, and then we also are going to be providing a series of resources that can help people, listeners who may need behavioral health resources or support with managing their own trauma. So
Mhm.
just stay with us. At the end of the video, we'll list some of our resources, and then we are going to be including more content on the channel, the YouTube channel, so that we think you'll find interesting and useful. But before we end today's discussion, Marie, I would like you to visit some key insights that you have for our viewers to help
Mhm.
them as they're getting to their
Mhm.
enough.
Mhm. Well, I have a few takeaways. What I really want to do is encourage other women and men as well to open up about their own traumatic experiences, mental health needs, and low feelings of self worth. As we continue the discussion, I believe that every woman who reads this book will be able to relate to my story in some way. Whether it be their experiences with adverse life experiences, relationship issues, career challenges, being perceived as angry, or knowing how to positively affirm themselves, I think that they will be able to relate to my memoir. In my Sip and Heal discussion series, in my logo, which we'll show you guys on our next episode, it is full of semicolons. And if you notice in the book, there are at the beginning of every chapter, I try to have a positive affirmation, because I really believe a lot in positive affirmations. But there was a butterfly that I use that actually has a semicolon. And that semicolon, when I was looking for symbols that represented resilience, we all always think about semicolons and punctuation and grammar. But what I found was that the semicolon was really a symbol that is used for those that are struggling with mental health challenge, as a sign that there's a pause, but there's a continuation. And that continuation of us going through and moving through life and moving through challenges, and understanding that we can heal. And I use the semicolon as my logo, because there's a pause in our lives. Everyone goes through something. And I think I said earlier, I think that the difference between me and other people is I'm sharing my story, because I want people to heal themselves. As a 58-year-old, it's still, every day it's still a process for me. And I want people to know that whether you're 18 or 38 or 58 or 88, you can heal from the things that you have gone through. So next time we can show them the logo so that they can understand what that semicolon is. And I thought it was important, because these chapters some of them are so heavy, that I start with positive affirmations, and then on many of the blank pages I also have positive affirmations as well, because that's really what I'm about, affirming who you are.
I noticed that, and I'm glad you mentioned that about the semicolon. And you know what? We'll get that in there at the end of the video, your logo, so
Okay.
viewers and listeners can check it out and see that semicolon delicately placed in the beautiful butterfly icon that you used.
Mhm.
Also, before we end this, you talked about your motivational, inspirational quotes, and there is one from Josephson.
Mhm.
Oh, gee, Michael Josephson. I know how
Mhm.
to say the name. At the beginning of chapter 1, and it says, "Take pride in how far you have come. Have
Yes.
faith in how far you will go, but
Mhm.
don't forget to enjoy the journey." And
Right.
so this is just the start of the journey of our discussion series. We
Mhm.
hope you guys will continue to come back as we continue on with this discussion series and this journey in getting to my enough by Dr. Marie Brown Mercadel. Some real quick action items for you. For those of you who are interested in the book, please feel free to go ahead and buy it. I got my copy. I don't have it here placed in front of me, but I got my copy, and you can purchase the book at mercadelconsultingsolutions.net. And we'll also make sure that we post those resources at the end of this video. We want you guys to make sure that you reach out and you connect with all of the support that's available to you as you're working through your trauma. And then also, we're talking about trauma. It may re-traumatize you, or you may feel slightly triggered or greatly triggered. Please make sure to speak to someone in your circle of support about your feelings and thoughts, and believe and affirm that you are enough. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you continue to join us as we move through the remaining 36 chapters of the book. Have a great afternoon, evening, morning, rest of your day, week, and remember, you can heal.